know if technically everything sounds okay. I am here as announced before with Daniel Hikikachu, who is a Muslim apologist and who is a Muslim who believes in a very in the who follows Islam traditionally and fundamentally. I want to quickly say a few words before I give the word to him and before we start. I just want to say briefly, this is, although it may appear like it, this is not meant to be a debate. So this is not meant to be a confrontation between, you know, where I want to defeat him or he wants to defeat me, although I don't know about his intentions here. But I don't want to... A debate is not the point. This is more of an inquiry where I want to ask questions to Daniel Hikikachu and ask him to justify and defend how he believes in the strict Islamic rulings and laws that he believes in. And I will be, of course, digging into his thoughts and his ideas. We will exchange ideas, try to find out truth, try to find out what is right and what is wrong, what can be justified and cannot be justified. This is really just a pursuit for reason and common sense and truth, and I believe that we have a common goal here. Quick note: I will not be able to read the chat and the super chats, but I do appreciate the comments very much. I will probably be able to look at them later. There are moderators in the chat who will keep track of the language and spamming and stuff like that. I would just ask the moderators to allow everything that is part of this conversation. So all opinions, even as absurd as they seem, they are part of this conversation. Just allow them. If you just see language abuse and spam, just look into controlling that, please. And that should be all that I have to say. As said, my guest here is Daniel Hikikachu, and Daniel, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Wonderful. Good, thank you. I really want to say, I really want to appreciate that you are here. I find it great that you agreed to have a talk with me, because I would think that many people who would be in your position in this confrontation wouldn't really want to sit down and just have a normal conversation with me. But you have agreed to have a peaceful, normal conversation for this sake of truth. So I really appreciate that you have joined me today. For all those who are curious, do you just want to briefly go into who you are, Daniel Hikikachu? Who is Daniel Hikikachu? What is your background, and what are you doing?
Yeah, so Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, Salatu ala Rasulillah. So I write online. I've been writing, lecturing, teaching online for over 10 years now. And I have a website, muslimskeptic.com. I founded an institute dedicated to growing Muslim faith in Islam, and specifically addressing these kinds of objections that often come up in the modern world against Islam. And so we're going to talk about a lot of these issues today. And the institute's name is Alesna Institute. So my background, was born and raised in the United States, are Iranian, and they're very secular. And I would say that maybe they have similar outlook as you regarding Islam and the rationality of Islam and so forth. So that's my background, a secular background. I always considered myself Muslim, but I would be considered non-practicing. Then I became more practicing in high school due to the influence of friends. And then in college, I really started studying Islam more deeply. So I went to Harvard University. I did a double major in physics and philosophy. Then I went to Tufts University to do a master's in philosophy. And that's where Daniel Dennett, if you know, one of the four horsemen of new atheism, he's a professor there. Interesting, no one in the faculty there likes him. Insider information on Daniel Dennett. But in college, so I started learning more and more about Islam, and my initial understanding of these kinds of cliches about Islam is a religion of peace. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a feminist. Islam is about tolerance and so forth. All of these things started to come in conflict with what I was learning about Islam. the history of Islam. I was getting more into the prophetic biography, the history of the companions, some of the more advanced texts within Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh. So all of these things, I was recognizing that, wow, Islam has things that deeply, deeply conflict with my understanding of what Islam was, and then things that conflict with the modern world and conflict with what I saw as common sense, right? The common sense of that everyone had about human rights, women's rights, tolerance, religious freedom of speech, all of these kinds of things. So there was a conflict between Islam on the one hand and then this modern common sense on the other, and they're mutually exclusive. And fortunately, I was in a situation where in the philosophy department, I could explore, well, how do I resolve this conflict? Which one is right? Is it Islam or these modern common sense? And I found out after, through undergrad and then graduate school, that actually what I thought was common sense was actually a very particular philosophy, Western philosophy, originating within the 18th and 19th century. British, French, and some German thinkers, their very particular philosophy about morality and the world, that had become the common sense of the modern world, that I was suffering from that kind of bias and that kind of indoctrination. So I found out and explored and realized that that philosophy is fundamentally incoherent, right? It's fundamentally incoherent. And in contrast, Islam, what had seemed so, strange and conflicting at first with my biased presuppositions, turned out to be far more superior, moral, rational. And then later on, I also started learning about the history of the Western world. Well, how does this very particular philosophy from white British and French thinkers become the dominant common sense of the world that even my parents, who are born and raised and lived most of their life in Iran, in the Middle East, on the other side of the world, how did they become indoctrinated by this? And I found the shocking history of Western imperialism and the imposition of these doctrines on the entire world in a very brutal and systematic way. So this was, really enlightening for me, and it made me realize that, when we look at the Western world, why are they in the position that they're in? And maybe you can help me understand this in our conversation. How is it that the Western world is at the position that it's in? Because this is often used as an argument against Muslims and against Islam. Islam is backwards. Look at the state of the world. Look at where Western countries are at compared to the Muslim world, and there's a huge discrepancy. And so I mean, the point of contention for me, because this is what the debate is, or this conversation is fundamentally about, is values, right? What are the superior values? And it seems obvious to many people that Islam, having things like Hudud, having things like capital punishment for adultery or for homosexual behavior, for apostasy, this is proof, very clear proof, that Islam does not have superior values. In fact, it's inferior, and that's why the Western world is so much at such a higher place. We have these values of freedom and equality and liberty, freedom of speech, and so forth. But I want to question that. I want to challenge that very directly, because I don't think that it's because of values. I think the values of the West were imposed, and there are many reasons why that it can't be values.
Do you think it is bad that these values, we haven't really given it a name, but do you think it is bad that these values were imposed on the rest of the world, especially on Islamic cultures in the Middle East?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it a bad thing?
Very bad.
You described it as brutal, for example, that these ideas were imposed on Islamic society. But weren't Islamic values throughout history for 1,400 years also imposed on the rest of the world? Didn't Islam, on its pursuit of establishing justice and truth, also impose Islam on every culture that it encountered?
Well, there are two things here that we have to separate. There is the question of imposition and the way that that imposition happens. I'll concede and agree with you that Islam is a universalist religion, that it believes, and we maintain that Islam should spread because Islam is good. Islam is the truth. Islam is what can produce human happiness in this life and salvation in the next. So it's universalist in that these values should spread, and sometimes that requires imposition, right? But this kind of imposition is shared. This idea that values should be imposed is shared by the Western tradition. So there's not really a difference there. Human rights are imposed through sanctions. Countries that violate human rights are sanctioned. There's intervention, military intervention that is used to coerce countries to comply with a international human rights security council mandate. So that's imposition. We agree on that, right? Do you agree that that's imposition?
I don't think it is the same thing, because I think when Western nations, by the way, I want to say I don't agree with imposing our philosophy or our ideas on other cultures. So if you base the entire point on, well, I agree with this imposition, so why don't I agree with that imposition? I would say I don't agree that Islam should be imposed on other cultures, and I also don't agree that liberalism should be imposed on other cultures, especially not through force, not through not directly, not militarily, not by dominating these cultures by force. I agree that they are imposed even nowadays in a way by saying if you want to be part of this union, then you have to accept these values. Or if you want to benefit from these benefits, then you have to accept these values. If you want to get support from us, if you want to have diplomatic relations with us, then you have to accept these values. That is the imposition that takes place from the point of the view of the West nowadays. But that isn't really quite the same as what Islam did over the 1,400 years, right? You would agree with that.
No, yeah, the Western imposition is far more brutal.
No, but Islam imposed values through direct war, through declaring war against all the nations that refused to accept. So
Operation Iraqi Freedom, was that about spreading? Wasn't that justified on the basis of spreading freedom and democracy?
I think that is a very particular case, which.
But that's actually the standard case. That's the universal case. Haven't you heard of the white man's burden, or the civilizing mission?
That is just a theory. I mean, the original.
No, that was a theory that drove the imperialism and colonialism that we're talking about.
But the point there is not to attack these cultures and spread your values onto them, especially not in today's time.
That's what civilizing burden means. Civilize the savages, and it wasn't just Muslims. It was Native Americans, it was Africans, it was Chinese, East Asians. Yeah, of course. Like, how can you deny this? There's entire fields, non-Muslims, entire fields of decolonial studies where they have volumes and volumes cataloging the imposition of white supremacy, European dominance across the entire globe. And it was justified on this idea that it was justified on a racial basis, that the white man is simply more intelligent and has a higher IQ and is therefore able to develop technology that leads to utopia, technology that leads to all of these goods, what they claimed were goods on the basis of the Enlightenment liberal philosophy. Then they had this burden imposed that, no, we're going to civilize these Muslims, these Africans, these Chinese. So they come into the light of reason. They let go of their dogmas. They let go of their abuse of women. They let go of their all of these bad things that we find in these savage cultures, and we're going to develop them. We're going to civilize them, and that was the basis. That was the basis of all the imperialism that came from the Western world and the colonization.
But we don't quite see that, though. I mean, Let me
What
make
I'm
this
saying?
point. When we look at colonization, for example, with colonization, the point was to expand Western power. For example, during it lasted until the First World War, for example, where the purpose of these powers was still to get as much dominance over Middle Eastern and African cultures as possible. And when they got this dominance, for example, they did impose their values. That is true. Which was not the primary goal. However, the primary goal was to exert power over these nations and to expand your own borders.
Well,
Whereas
you're just
with
proving
Islam, for
that it
example,
was. You're just proving that, or you're claiming that wasn't altruistic. That's fine. Like I don't. I agree that they had a kind of motive for self.
I'm not claiming that they were altruistic. I'm not claiming that they were after something good. I am actually recognizing that these nations, these cultures, these governments, these kingdoms, these regimes were after power. That was basically. That is what happened before the 20th century.
I thought you're
and
making
early
a
into the
distinction
20th century.
between Islam expanding and the West expanding. And I'm saying that no, they were both expansionist. I was going to make the real distinction. There's no distinction between wanting to expand, wanting to impose values. Whether the ulterior motive is okay, I agree with you. When Islam wants to expand, it cares about people's afterlife and their flourishing in this life, and the values are meant to inculcate that kind of flourishing. So if you want to say that the West actually doesn't care about freedom and liberty and all of this, fine, I can concede that point.
No, I do actually think that they care, but the problem that I want to come to is you are for example comparing today's liberalism to Islam. I mean, we see in the world that liberalism dominates the world. The West dominates the world. The West has complete power over Middle Eastern nations at the moment and over many other nations. Yet we don't see that even nations that were controlled by the West or that are still very much under the influence of the West, that are vastly supported through fundings by the West, that these nations abandon Islamic values and completely turn towards secularism. Even nations that were established by Western powers, like the UK, for example. When you look at Pakistan is still an Islamic republic, for example, which has kept their Islamic values and their Islamic laws. They have never abolished the law that you are. That you are not meant to defame Islam in order to spread your own beliefs. Similarly, with other Middle Eastern cultures, it is still forbidden by law in many of them to do missionary work for Christianity, for example, or to speak against Islam, to publicly apostatize. So these cultures have evidently not adopted liberalism, and liberal nations today are still not enforcing anything on them. In fact, I could blame them. I could blame them for having the United Nations and still working with all those nations without making them accept very basic human rights values, such as the right to choose your own religion, or the right to spread your own religion, or the right to leave your religion, the right to criticize your former religion. These rights don't exist in many cultures today. So how can we possibly say that the West, liberalism, similarly and aggressively spreads their ideas and imposes them on others, as Islam does? Because when we look at Islam, we see that wherever Islam went, Islam relentlessly imposed its own worldview.
There's a lot of distinctions here, so I just want to take the time to make them. To respond to your point that there are Muslim countries that are practicing the Sharia, I'd really disagree with that. Yes, there are countries that have remnants of Islamic law, but most of them there's been an imposition of a kind of constitutional democracy, a kind of secularism that has a Muslim flavor to it. Like, you can't say that in a country like Egypt that this is an Islamic state. It's ruled by a secular dictator, and Muslims who advocate for Islamic governance are routinely detained and even murdered and assassinated. So these countries, I'll grant you that the West, in its dominance and imposition across the entire globe, will allow tokenism and will allow Muslims, as long as it doesn't threaten their power. If there are countries that threaten the West's power in any way by even not using the dollar as their currency for international trade, they will be brought into submission. Okay, and this is why it's very hard to dispute this. Like, it's not something that happened years ago. It's ongoing process.
It's about power, though, right? It's not about ideology. It's about power.
Like I said, we can concede that, but no. The power is through the ideology, and it's through. Look at what's happening throughout the Muslim world. Unfortunately, we find many Muslims who are secularizing, who are leaving their values, and it's because of their entire structure of society has been gutted by a secular system, by the atomization of capitalism, by consumerism, by a global media that is constantly broadcasting a Western secular liberal ideology into everyone's homes, on the internet, on social media, which is highly regulated according to liberal values. Like, I'm worried that this stream is going to be deleted by YouTube for the things that I'm saying. So how can we say that that's not imposition and control and the imposition of ideology? So I wanted to talk more about this, on this difference on the issue of free speech, but we'll get to it when we talk about apostasy. But the other distinction with Islam spreading, so one of the big differences is that because of the historical time period, Muslims never had weapons of mass destruction. We never had chemical weapons. We never had bombs. So the spread of Islam was not bloody in the same way that modern warfare and modern expansionism has been bloody, and that's a big difference. The other thing is that Islam's expansion wasn't racial.
Necessity, though, right? out of the conditions that
genocide is by necessity.
I don't know about that. They weren't as bloody as 20th century expansions, because Islam didn't have access to these weapons of mass destruction, because Islam basically failed before these weapons came into existence.
I mean, I don't know how that's a positive for the West, but okay. So then, when it comes to genocide, the expansion of Islam also wasn't racial. It wasn't racial, whereas in the West, it is racial. The white race, the British and the French and Western Europe, it was on the basis of their supposed higher IQ and the civilizing burden, the white man's burden, to expand. So that's another very big difference. Whereas Muslims allowed anyone to convert. So when Muslims were expanding, I agree with you. They incentivized conversion to Islam. So yes, that is an imposition of values, but again, it's altruistic. It's not, we're going to decimate you and kill you because you're not Muslim. No, the impetus was that we want you to convert. And that's why Muslim civilization has been extremely racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse. They've been united by Islam as a religion. We don't see that when it comes to the majority of other civilizations, past and present, which are ethnic in nature, racial in nature. We want to expand our race, our people. And that kind of violence that they have to use is on the basis, well, let's just wipe out the other races and ethnicities. Whereas that's not the impetus, and it wasn't. And and this is not me like putting sugarcoating on it. You can read the actual texts from Islamic scholars from 500, 1,000 years ago.
I want to come to the source of this, though, to the reason of this. That's actually a great point to stand on for a second. I know we are far off where we are supposed to be in our discussion right now. But actually, the distinction between Western nations and nation states and Islam as which puts more emphasis on religion. I think this is the distinction is very clear. Racism is, for example, it was a problem in the West, whereas religious supremacy was a problem in the Islamic world, and that is, I think, the reason to this might be not very clear to many people, but is actually very clear if you logically dive into into what these nations are built on. When Western nations converted to Christianity and fell apart as an empire, they created nation states, and the foundation of their states were the nation. This is the French nation, this is the British nation, this is the German nation, whatever. Or the German nation was even tinier nations. But the point is that the foundation of their societies were their nations, their national identity, racial identity, skin colors, and languages, and these values that they have. Whereas in Islamic society, the foundation of the nation was religion. In Islam, race didn't matter, religion mattered. But if you look at it in the end, while the Western society prioritized the race and the nation, the Islamic society prioritized the religion, which is Islam, and oppressed lesser people, minorities. Now, you could argue that race and religion are not equal, are not the same thing, because you cannot switch out of your nation or your race, while you can switch out of your religion as you wish. The problem is they are certainly not the same thing, but just to point out,
no, I agree.
The reason one matters here and the other matters there is simply the foundation of these societies. You would agree that a Buddhist, for example, or a Hindu, or someone who worships rocks and statues, or someone who apostatizes from Islam, like me, for example, wouldn't have the same right in an Islamic society that you as a Muslim would have, right?
Yes, I agree.
You would agree with that. So in an ideal Islamic society, you would be the ideal person. It would be a supremacy of you as a Muslim. Whereas I, as someone who has left Islam, wouldn't even have the right to enjoy those same equal rights, because under Islamic law, I wouldn't any longer be part of the ideal identity of society, which is religion, as opposed to race in Western states. And as a result, I would be executed under an Islamic state. That's true, right?
No, yes, we're going to get to that, but you're conflating two things here. You're making it seem like Islam has this, let's call it like value supremacy. It believes that its values are supreme. Yeah, but I'm saying that that's exactly the same as any other culture, any other universalist system of values and beliefs is true of liberalism, past and present. Liberals are universalists. They believe their values are superior to the values of religion, to Islam. They're also supremacists, and they. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Sorry, there was just a thing.
Do you think that values, liberal values, are superior to religion, or let's say Confucianism, or traditional 18th century Buddhism? So you're a value supremacist as well.
No, I would say I look at it from a utilitarian perspective. I don't consider that there is some divine or natural truth within these values, which is why one is superior to the other. I would say that liberalism is
irrelevant. That's just
better.
Incidental.
No, I would say that liberalism is better because it provides. It corrects things as they should be corrected, because the basis of its morality doesn't depend on what some divine source, or what some book, or what some person 500 or 1,000 years ago told us, but rather what we, for example, scientifically find, or through thought find. For example, the idea behind liberalism is that we should emphasize equality before the law and human freedom, because if we leave progress to religions or to traditionalism, which restrict society, then we will always find ourselves in revolutions, because as much as governments and traditions restrict society, those people who want to move on and who don't agree with the supreme system will eventually explode and destroy the system. Which is why in liberalism we should allow everyone to be equal and to be free, and slowly move on.
Right. So you're just giving a story of why liberalism is supreme or superior in terms of its values. You have justification for that. That's fine. That's fine. Well, let me finish. You have that story that you're giving, and I can provide a story for why Islam is superior and why these liberal values are incoherent, because that's what I claimed at the beginning of our discussion. So, but the point that I want to emphasize here, and I think it's very crucial, is that you are still a supremacist in terms of your values, in terms of liberalism. Okay, so,
we all are, of course.
Okay, great. That's all I want you to agree to. And the reality is that liberalism is being imposed that liberalism is being imposed throughout the world by force. And you agreed that that's the case. That's the history of the West. That's the history of the Western world.
That it does not impose on the same level, especially not today. I mean,
today is the most suppressive, brutal regime that has ever existed. The amount of control that the secular liberal regimes and this world order imposes on the individual is unprecedented in every single respect because of technology, because of surveillance. Like, you can't go and park your car in a certain part of the street without the state hammering you if it's against the law or if it's against the policy, right?
Okay.
The amount of control and oppression that exists today is far greater than anything from any civilization in the past. And that's because of technology. It's because of the logic of the state and secularism, right? This is the logic of secularism that is imposed. It is imposed across the entire world. You don't even a small Southeast Asian country like Brunei announcing, like a population less than 1 million, I think, announcing that it wants to, reintroduce Hudud, this penal punishment within Islamic law. It can't announce that without the entire world saying that it's going to sanction it. It's going to. There's laws introduced by Ilhan Omar in Congress. The Muslim who is anti-Sharia. How is that not imposition? Right. That is brutal imposition.
What were the methods used in order to impose
the threat of sanctions?
The threat of sanctions.
Sanctions are extremely violent.
Can you briefly define what sanctions are?
Sanctions means we're not going to trade with your country. We've gotten your country dependent on our money and our resources through trade. You're now hooked, right? You're hooked on the world economically. We're going to cut that off. Like, haven't you read Confessions of an Economic Hitman?
Of course. But
okay, is that fiction or fact?
What I'm trying to get to here is you're saying that liberal values are brutally imposed on the rest of the world, but the example that you're giving is simply Western people saying, "Hey, if you impose a death penalty for gay people, then we will stop trading with you."
Yeah, to starve you. To starve your children, like we did with Iraq. 500,000 children starved to death, and when Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, was asked in the 90s. Do you think that that's a cost that should be paid for our values, for U.S. interests? And she said, yeah, 500,000 children, no problem. Let them starve. Let them starve from sanctions. That's the most violent thing that you can find in history. Muslims never did anything like that. Muslims never starved 500,000 children. Where? Show me.
Okay, let me ask you something. Let's imagine a historical Islamic empire, which, as we have almost always had throughout the 1,400 years of Islam. The Islamic empire stands here. It is ruled by the Islamic Caliphate, which imposes the Islamic truth, the supremacy of Islam, onto everything it dominates and onto everything that it can possibly dominate. And it's always at war. As Islamic scholars have agreed throughout history, an Islamic empire should strive through spreading Islam through contract or through war, if contract doesn't work. So let's imagine this scenario. An Islamic empire exists. Next to it, a tiny country says, hey, we accepted Islam before, but we don't really want to abide by that right now anymore. So forget about Islam. From now on, we will open gay clubs here. People will dance around. Will be gay. Will be naked, and this will all be approved by us in the name of tolerance and whatever. And you should just keep out of that. What would the Islamic Empire do in that position as a reaction?
It would invade. It would invade, and I had conceded that at the beginning. I said that there's force, and there's a good reason for the benefit of those people. For the benefit of those people, they would Islam would come and impose Islamic law. Yeah, of course, I conceded that. Just like the liberal supremacist will say that, oh, this country is not allowing gay sex and gay clubs, and this country is not marriages. Like they practice polygamy, they practice their women have to cover in this particular way. Their women aren't allowed to do X, Y, and Z. We know that they're a small country of agrarian farmers and goat herders. Guess what? We're going to drone them incessantly. We're going to invade and make sure that their women take off the burqa and that their women are sent to read, our Western literature. And we're going to drone them and invade them, and we're going to drive them into the ground, send them back to the Stone Age if they don't accept.
Okay, I think we're going far off the point.
No, that is the point. That is exactly the point.
Let's collect the comparison again. So we were talking about Brunei is a country that wants to impose the death penalty on homosexuals. Wants to say if you are homosexual, if you commit a homosexual intercourse within this country, you will be put to death. Whereas a different country wants to deviate from Islam and wants to allow homosexuality and open gay clubs and nudity. Brunei is forced to change their laws through sanctions from the West, whereas this tiny country is forced to change through invasion by the Islamic Empire.
So both of them are by force. You agree that both of them are by force, right? Because the conversation will just boil down.
Okay. Yeah. Let me go through this. I wouldn't at all describe the one compared to the other one, especially as force. I would remotely say. I would only say. I don't know if the word compelled, although it is a synonym, doesn't carry the same weight. I would rather use that. It is not force, as in Islamic
coerced is not the same as force.
How do you think you described? You described forcing through sanctions as more brutal than forcing through invasion.
No, it's force. No, the invasion, okay, you're imagining, okay, don't imagine Western invasion, right? Because, of course, that's extremely brutal and bloody and millions will die. That's not how Islamic offensive jihad was actually fought. It was because that's not the nature of pre-modern warfare. I mean, that's just a historical fact. Like, you have the battle happens in an area, territory, and then there's a winning army and a losing army, and then the losing army is enslaved or whatever the penalty. Yeah, we'll talk about it. What happens to the losers in modern warfare by the West? What happens to them? Well, they're in a crater. They're in a crater. They're dust. You can't even see their remains. So don't save the laughing. But look, the difference is that there's imposition. Right. Let me get to the point. Sorry. No. Let me finish. Okay. Fine. You want to say that? Okay, fine. There can be many ways to coerce. That Islamic example, like the Islamic empire and then the small gay country, the empire can also impose sanctions. That's fine, but the point is that there is coercion. Coercion means force, and whether that is through market manipulation, if it's through diplomatic manipulation, if it's through actual physical force. Okay, those are all coercion. So that's not really the difference between the two scenarios. The difference is in the value, right? The value of is homosexual practice something that's good for society or something that's bad, right? In the same way that the liberal supremacist makes the judgment that women wearing a burqa or getting married at a younger age than 18 is something that is wrong and has to be stamped out and wiped out across the world, and we're going to use force in order to do that, right? So that's a discussion about values, and I have to justify that, right? Because you're speaking with a lot of your listeners, it'll seem very obvious that what's wrong? There's nothing wrong with homosexual behavior. So, of course, Daniel looks like a monster and Islam looks completely irrational because it wants to impose something that is barbaric and contrary to what is common sense, right? So I have to talk about... We'll come to that. Yeah, we'll have to come to that. But that's all I want to establish is that they're both coercive. They both implement force. And the difference... So at that conceptual level, they're the same. I would argue further, however, and you can feel free to disagree, but the modern methods and the European imperial methods involve genocide, were based on racial supremacy, and were far more barbaric because of technology, and also because of conceptually, or in terms of if you're a materialist, 1,000 people dying, 500,000 people dying, okay, who cares? Whereas a Muslim is thinking these are souls, and we want them to become Muslim. We want them to become Muslim, right? So there is a discussion on that basis, and you can feel free to disagree with that.
I think it's a big misrepresentation of materialism, or what someone who lacks belief would actually think about human life. But I want to do just two very brief things. The entire point of that comparison was just, I want to ask you why you would think that that imposing sanctions, as in we will not trade with you, like we, the West, will not trade with you any longer if you impose these laws, why that is more brutal than invading a country and forcibly changing the law of the country. How is that? How do you define it? If you just can briefly explain it.
I didn't say that they're more or less. I didn't say they're more or less.
You said it's more brutal.
No, I said as a whole, like just because of the scale of it, like you're switching between a historical comparison versus a conceptual comparison. Nothing that Muslims have done historically is as brutal as the mass killing that has occurred by the hands of the West, and that's because of technology, right?
But we are now not comparing concepts, but rather just
right. So that was the historical comparison, but you're sliding in back and forth between them. Conceptually, I agree with you that all else being equal, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, the sanctions are going to be potentially less violent. It depends on the nature of it, but they're both coercive. That was the point.
Okay, so we have to come to the point that they are both in a way forced. So they're both in a way.
Come on, 500,000 children, Iraqi children, starving to death. That's not forced.
I got it. So we have to come to the point that they're both in a way forced, but we have to agree that they are, as a concept, invading versus imposing sanctions are not brutal on the same level.
No, I can see that. I agree.
Okay, sure.
No, sanctions and invasion, of course, they're not the same.
Okay, I want to. We spent a lot of time on this. We actually wanted to talk about the whole topic of my video, and you came here because you watched my video that I made about you. I asked you if you would like to have a conversation with me, or I hinted that I would like to host you and let you present your ideas by yourself without me possibly taking them out of context. So here you are, and the topic of the video was that you defend the strict Islamic laws, such as the Hudud laws, which are laws that are prescribed by Islam directly, such as the killing of people who commit homosexual interactions or intercourse, killing of adulterers, the lashing of fornicators and otherwise sexual deviants, punishment of apostasy, punishment of blasphemy. These were things that we wanted to talk about. I would like to, before we go into the discussion, let you explain. Do you believe in these things as I have represented them? What is the summary of your political beliefs of Islam on society when it comes to morals, like sexual deviance or LGBT or apostasy or blasphemy, for example?
No, well, obviously I believe in those things, and I believe that the politics and the governance of a society is based on the basis of Islam and Islamic law, as traditionally understood for 1400 years.
So according to your Islamic beliefs, which are based on the fundamental laws of Islam, what should happen in an ideal Islamic system? What should happen to someone who commits homosexual intercourse?
So when it comes to all the hudud, they're procedural, they're based on witness testimony, they're based on a court, just like any crime that we find in Western governance and jurisprudence. And then if someone is convicted for doing the homosexual act, male to male, that's important because there's a distinction between whether it's females or males doing it. So male to another male, then both of them convicted, the penalty is capital punishment in Islamic law.
Okay, so males who commit homosexual intercourse and where it is proven or where they admit, they should be sentenced to death. That is the summary of that. What about adultery? People who are caught, who are married and who are caught having sex with someone that they're not married to. What is supposed to happen to them under Islamic law?
The same thing. It's procedural. There's a certain bar for evidence. So it's a high bar for evidence, just like any capital crime, but it's capital punishment for a married individual who is engaged in extramarital sexual relations. It's a high bar for evidence, and anyone who has read about this topic knows about 4 upright male witnesses having to see the penetrative act. And then if that bar is reached, then it's capital punishment through stoning. And then, but I mean, if there's not 4 witnesses, maybe there's only 2 witnesses, the judge can have lower than that as a punishment, such as lashing. So there's still corporal punishment for those things if the evidentiary bar is not met. So I'm very clear on this. Like, I'm not trying to distort. This is exactly what all of the scholars Islamically agreed on, because it's in the Quran, or the ruling is from the Quran. The actual verse is abrogated, but the ruling is there. The lashing for fornication is there in the Quran. The punishment, capital punishment for same-sex behavior is mentioned in hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So I mean, I'm not trying to what I want to argue, okay, and the whole point of being here is to talk about the logic of hudud, to see how can this be made sense, like a non-Muslim.
I'll come to that. Okay. I will come to that. I want to quickly move on. I'm an apostate by the definition of Islam. I am a murtad by Islam's definition, which means I have left my Islamic belief behind. I've publicly said that I've left Islam, and I'm also explaining to the public why I left Islam and openly criticizing Islam. What would happen to me under an ideal Islamic state?
The capital punishment. I mean, so again, procedural, and I mean, your case is different because it's 2 separate issues. It's apostasy and then also insulting Islam. So blaspheming Islam, insulting the Prophet, peace be upon him, that's a separate offense. So usually if it's just apostasy, then you have an opportunity to repent and come back to Islam. And there's like a 3-day window, and you're given the opportunity to do that, and then there's no punishment beyond that.
That's just that trivial, though, right? I mean,
yeah. I'm not saying it. I'm just trying to be accurate in describing what it is, right? I'm not saying that. Then it solves the moral problem that people have with it. So then, but with insulting and blaspheming, then that's just there's no like repentance. Like that has a higher, in a sense, severity to it, because there's not.
Do you think I should be sentenced to death for who I am in an ideal Islamic state, under an ideal Islamic government?
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. Did I not just describe exactly what the Islamic law prescribes in that situation?
I just want to make it clear. Like, I just want to bring the life example right here. You believe that I should be...
I said the same thing to Armin. I said the same thing to Armin. I said the same thing to all of the murtadeen, the apostates that I've spoken to.
Okay. I want to ask you one question before I want to go into all of these. I want to ask the question of consistency. I don't want to ask this to just to get you or anything, but this is something that is kind of an elephant in the room. People ask it before and during our conversation. They will ask it afterwards. It comes up to me. It's a necessary question. You believe that that an ideal government, an ideal state, an ideal nation should be led by these Islamic laws that are strictly applied, under which I am not allowed to speak, I should be put to death for my ideas, or homosexuals should be put to death, adultery should be put to death, and all these things. Obviously, you don't agree that that liberalism is a good system, and you think that liberalism is a terrible, bad, immoral system. But I want to ask you, where do you live, Daniel?
I mean, I live in the U.S.
You live in the U.S. Why do you live in the U.S.? I mean, this is a question.
Can I just explain that this system of liberalism is imposed on the entire globe, and that there is no country in the world today that actually implements the Sharia in the fullest meaning and sense of it? I wish that I could go to a country and that's ruled by Sharia, that the West won't bomb and sanction and destroy. I wish I had that opportunity, but unfortunately I can't because of liberal supremacism.
But that just seems like a way out of this whole of the whole thought, because wouldn't it be more honest and more consistent with yourself, especially also to prove to others that you are trying to spread to your ideas too, that wouldn't it be much better for you to be consistent with your worldview, to move to a country, for example, that is, although it is not perfect,
where? What country? What country should I move to?
Ruled by Islam.
What country should I move to?
Any country.
Should I move to Saudi Arabia, where they are imprisoning scholars for saying anything in line with the Sharia? If I were in Saudi,
for example, yes.
right? Why are they doing that? Saudi is doing that because of who? The West, right? Because of Israel, right? Because of America, right?
You glorified Brunei, for example. You wrote an article.
Yeah, look what happened to them.
Look
what happened to them.
What happened to them is that they couldn't enforce the death penalty for homosexuality.
So was there Sharia there? So what's the difference?
Of course, but what I'm saying is, isn't Brunei, logically, anyone can see this, isn't Brunei much closer to your ideal world than America?
Well, I mean, there's other issues as well, like with me personally, because I was born in the U.S. These countries aren't giving me citizenship. They won't give me citizenship in many cases. And unfortunately, because of the nation-state system, if you're not a citizen, you aren't born there, then you're a second-class citizen. Like, you want to talk about discrimination, and you want to talk about two-tier status in Islamic law, look at the modern nation-state and the two-tier status between citizens and non-citizens, and the different treatment on the basis of where you were born. How is that more rational than the kind of treatment within Islamic law on the basis of belief? Like the believer, the Muslim versus the non-Muslim. The non-Muslim within Islamic law always has the opportunity to become a Muslim, whereas someone who is not born within the U.S. and for some reason doesn't meet the requirements set by this state will never be a U.S. citizen. And the entire world is prevented from that. And all of these other countries follow the same kind of constitutional democracy, secularism, and so forth that has been imposed on the world. So, I mean, there's that, and there's also personal. No. That's exactly the reason. I have also personal reasons because my family is here. My family, my parents are here. They're elderly. Like, I can't just leave them. So if you want the complete, honest answer, that's a big part of it. But if it weren't for, take it for what it's worth. But if it weren't for my parents being here, I would leave the United States. I would leave the United States.
But you have just given many reasons why you wouldn't go to those states.
Yeah, I would. It's so intolerable that I would. Unfortunately, like the kind of things that are happening in the U.S. and the way that identity politics is being used and how LGBT is being shoved down everyone's throats. All schools will be enforced, have to teach this ideology. It is extremely oppressive for a Muslim. Like, you want to talk about oppression. In terms of ideology, if for someone like me, right, it is extremely oppressive to have a different kind of perspective and view. There's no tolerance for something that's truly contrary to the status quo within the West. It's very oppressive, and I would love to go to somewhere else in the world, but I can't because first of all, the citizenship problems. Second of all, the fact that the U.S. and the UN Security Council is going to sanction and bomb any country that actually does engage in that. The U.S. engages in extrajudicial dronings, assassinations. So someone like me, someone who is actually going to be advocating for Islam and going against the interests of the West, is going to face potential assassination. That's the level of control that the West imposes.
I want to interrupt you here. I lived in Turkey for 10 years. Mm-hmm. I lived in Germany for 15 years. I lived in Turkey for 10 years. I live in America now. When I compare all these countries to Turkey, when I lived in Turkey, I was completely uncomfortable living there. And I couldn't go on with my life. It just wasn't me. I thought, I cannot live in this country. This country doesn't align with my values. Because although you would describe Turkey as a country, as a nation that is not by any means Islamic at all, because it is completely under, it is ruled by the idea of secularism, because Turks themselves secularized Turkey, it is still on a societal level, it is still very much dominated by Islamic sentiments, and there are still a lot of people within the country that want to impose the Islamic sentiments on other people within the country. I can assure you I can assure you that there are many people in Turkey that share the exact same ideas that you share, that advocate for these systems. And if we go further from Turkey to other places, to other Middle Eastern nations or other Muslim nations, there are people who advocate for much more than that, who say much more than you say, and they live quite comfortably in countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Qatar or even other countries.
What are you talking about?
You're saying,
you mentioned the exact countries.
You're saying there is no country. Let me explain, please. You're saying there is no country that you could possibly go to and be comfortable with. I mean, you know that there are several countries that you could, if you really wanted to, move to and to live your life peacefully. You know that, right? I mean, you are aware that there are multiple Muslim nations that you could still move to instead of living in America, where you could live your life peacefully, where you would be eventually accepted as a citizen.
I mean, you're changing the goalpost, because at first you're saying go to a country that has Sharia, that has Islamic law, and I said, where does such a country? Now, if it's just comfortable, okay, what do you mean by comfortable? Is it comfortable to live in any of these countries?
I'm not saying comfortable in the sense of freedom. I'm saying comfortable in the sense of what is closer to your ideal world. Because when you look at many Muslim countries, they are definitely closer to your ideal Islamic system and Islamic